Hello, everybody. So the purpose of this video is to show the slides for your Confucianism note taker, and so it's about Confucius and his teachings. So I'm going to go ahead. This slide right here, I would pause the video to copy this down in your notes. It may take you a little bit of time, and I would pause, and then I'll speak about them in just a second. So go ahead and pause now, and then when you want to hear me speak about them, go ahead and start playing again. So Confucius was a man born in 551 BC and he died in 479 BC. He was a Chinese philosopher and teacher whose beliefs had a great influence on Chinese life. Philosophy is a system of beliefs and values, and so since Confucius was a philosopher, he is somebody who really, delved deep into philosophy. He thought about philosophy. He developed systems of beliefs and values. Civil service is the group of people whose job it is to carry out the work of the government. And analects are the collection of Confucius's sayings, so kind of like his quotes. The life of Confucius. So the most famous and most important of the early Chinese thinkers is known as Confucius. The Chinese called him Kung Fu Si, or Master Kung, and the name was later translated into Confucius. Like I said, the best way to do this is to probably pause the video and copy down the answers and then restart the video. His early years in life. So he's born in 551 BC. He lived during a period of chaos. If you remember when we talked about ancient China, we talked about the dynastic cycles and how all these different groups were coming into power in China, and they would be at war with each other, and there was the Warring States period. And so he's living in China during the early dynasties. He was born into a noble family, but the family was poor. So even though you were noble, that didn't mean you always had money. His family was not very wealthy. He did love to learn, however, and he was mostly self-taught. So he didn't really have teachers teaching him. He just was self-taught. He hoped to be an important government official, and although he briefly was a state official for the government, he eventually became a teacher. He did love to learn, and he was self-taught, so it does make sense that that would be the path that he finds himself in. And so he's a pioneer teacher. In class, we talked about what it means to be a pioneer, and to be a pioneer is like the first to do something, one of the first people, one of the first groups. And so he's possibly China's first professional teacher. He charged students a fee to take classes with him, and he taught about his views on government and life. And so people would come and listen to him and explain those things to them. So I kind of compared it a little bit to like a college class, like how you pay to go to college and have people teach you. That's what people were doing with Confucius. So bringing order to society. Confucius's goal was to bring order to the chaotic society he lived in. He believed that if people could be taught to behave properly toward each other, it would result in order and peace in China. And the result would be a prosperous society. So China was kind of like, you struggle when you're in these cycles of new people coming to power constantly, or people fighting over power. And so they're struggling through that. And he wants people to be peaceful and prosper together. So over to the right here, you can see the dynastic cycle. We had a version of the dynastic cycle that we drew in our notes over ancient China. This is just another version and kind of summarizes it in a little bit of a different way. So you have the new dynasty here. A new dynasty forms, and after several generations, the dynasty becomes an aging dynasty. And so you have the aging dynasty, and an aging dynasty is going to start to lose its kind of influence and control over people. And so it loses the mandate of heaven. If you remember when we talked about ancient China, the mandate of heaven is the belief that the dynasties, whoever was in control at that time, was given control by heaven, that they were chosen by heaven to be in control. So when they lose that mandate of heaven, when they lose that belief that they were, chosen by heaven to control China, it creates problems in the government, lots and lots of problems. And because of those problems, a new dynasty, a new group is able to claim the mandate of heaven. They kind of come in and they like seize that and take over. So Confucius lived during a time of warfare in China. Powerful rulers from different states fought for control of China, and they seemed more interested in power rather than ruling wisely. So they would come to power, they'd get this power, and then they wouldn't really control and rule the government in a very wise manner. Confucius hoped to convince them to change their ways and bring peace and order to China. So he wanted to focus on ruling wisely and, doing things in a more appropriate manner to him rather than just fighting over power and control. In his later years in life, Confucius searched unsuccessfully for a ruler who would follow his teachings. So toward the end of his life, Confucius searched unsuccessfully for a ruler who would follow his teachings. He wanted China's rulers to embrace his ideas, his beliefs and values, and he wasn't able to do that while he was alive. He died at age 73 in the year 479 BC, and he felt his life was a failure by the time he died. But he never knew that his teachings would be followed by billions of Chinese for many centuries. So even though he was not able to find a ruler in his lifetime to follow him, rulers in China do follow Confucianism for many, many years following this. So the teachings of Confucius. Confucius did not claim to be an original thinker. He felt that his role was to pass on forgotten teachings of wise people from an earlier age. Many of his teachings tried to convince rulers to become better leaders, and Confucius also hoped to bring peace, stability, and prosperity to China's kingdoms. And so that's a very common concept that we see with Confucius, is that he was less focused on power and more focused on prosperity and peace in China. So he believed people should know their place in the family and society. And so people should respect those above them and below them, and people should treat others justly. So you respect everyone, essentially. There were 5 human relationships that were focused on: the ruler and the ruled, the father and the son, the husband and the wife, the older sibling and the younger sibling, and friend and friend. And so those are different relationships and different dynamics in each relationship, and there's different structures to each relationship, but there should be a mutual respect in each of those relationships. He said, "Do not do to others what you don't want done to yourself," which is similar to the golden rule. A lot of you have probably heard your parents or somebody say, "Don't treat somebody how you wouldn't want to be treated." Confucius never wrote down his teachings. His students actually gathered a collection of his teachings after his death. And those teachings, those writings, were called the Analects and make up a philosophy. A philosophy, like we said, is a system of beliefs and values, and the Analects are the writings. They're like quotes from Confucius. And so Confucianism is one of several important philosophies from ancient China. Taoism is a Chinese philosophy from the same period of time. And so that's why we kind of group them together, because they're both Chinese philosophies that kind of occurred at the same time in history. So the influence that Confucius had, he said that people in authority must set good examples. If a ruler was fair, his people would follow his example and treat others fairly too. The teachings of Confucius had a major effect on Chinese government, and they became part of the basic training for members of the civil service, which is a group of people who carry out the work of the government. So if you wanted to work in the government, in whatever role it may be in the government in China, you had to study Confucius and his teachings. You had to go through that as your basic training to be able to work for the government. So obviously, if you have to learn all of that just to be able to work for the government, then it's going to really have an effect on how the government functions. So, a merit system. Before Confucianism, government positions were given to the sons of powerful people. After Confucianism was adopted, any man could hold a government based off of merit. Merit is how qualified a person is to do their job. So you can think of this as, a lot of roles that we have in society now are based on merit. You don't get it necessarily always based on who your parents are, but you do get it based on how hard you work, how qualified you are for a job. You know, you can't become a teacher without having a teaching license, so I'm qualified as a teacher. Candidates for government jobs had to pass official exams to get their jobs as well, and the exams were based on the teachings of Confucius. So like I said, if you wanted to work for the government and civil service, you had to study Confucius, and then you had to take an exam over that. The examination system didn't allow everyone to work as civil servants. You needed to be able to read. To be able to take the exams, you needed to be able to read. This made it very difficult for the poor and undereducated. So even though it's based on merit and not necessarily who your parents are, it is still difficult for poor and undereducated people to become civil servants. Still, many poor but talented young men taught themselves to read and rose to high government positions. So this is the story of the tiger. One day, the Chinese teacher and philosopher Confucius and his students were walking through the countryside. In the distance, they heard a woman crying. As they came around a bend in the road, they saw the woman kneeling at a grave. "Why are you crying?" they asked her. "Because," she answered, "a tiger killed my husband's father. Later, the tiger also killed my husband. Now the tiger has killed my son as well." They then asked the woman, "Why do you stay in this place after these terrible things have happened?" The woman answered, "Because there are no cruel rulers here." Confucius turned to his students and said, "Remember this, a cruel ruler is fiercer and more feared than a tiger." So that's an example of the story and just how important it was to Confucius that rulers be able to interact with people appropriately. So stories of Confucius. After his death, people told many stories based on Confucius's teachings, such as this story about the tiger. Like the story of the woman and the tiger, most stories contain an important lesson. So not just, the story, but the lesson behind the story was the important part. So Confucius would have been surprised at the influence he had on China, considering that he thought that he died as a failure. This would be very surprising to him. He did not consider himself particularly wise or good, but he left a lasting mark on Chinese life. Most of Confucius's stories contain an important lesson. So there's always a lesson behind the story. It's not just, the story for fun. It is an important lesson. So these are activities that we will do together in class. So that is all that we need to cover right now, and make sure you have your notes all filled in, and I will see you in class.